the numbers, so I think we'll probably get started. Thank you to everybody for coming. My name is Nisha McSweeney. I'm the academic editor of Anatolian Studies. And we are, as I've just mentioned, at the very end of our first year of Anatolian Studies virtual seminars. Thank you to everyone who's been coming consistently over the last year. It's been a real joy to have you all, especially since it's been quite a lonely year, for me at least. I hope not so much for everyone else, but it's been nice to be able to share this with all of you and to get to talk and meet, I was going to say face-to-face, but not quite, face-to-face-ish with all of our brilliant authors who've been publishing in volume 2020, that's volume 70 for the year 2020. And so we're rounding it off with Anja Slawisch, who is a lecturer in Greek archaeology at the University of Edinburgh, and Toby Wilkinson, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in the Catalan Institute of Classical Archaeology, if that's right. And without further ado, I'm going to hand straight over to them because it is them that you have all signed up to see. Are you able to share your screens?
Oh, this is where it all collapses, right?
Oh, that's looking good. Right, I shall leave it to you then.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. Thank you, Nish, for the introduction and for hosting us, and of course for the Anatolian Studies and the British Institute at Ankara for this opportunity to present the work that went into our 2020 Anatolian Studies article. Let's see. Okay. So the work for this article was done in the context of the project Panormos. The project began as a rescue excavation of an archaic period necropolis at Panormos near modern Edinburgh, jointly under the Milesian Museum and the German Archaeological Institute, Istanbul. From 2015, we began an intensive survey in the surrounding areas of the Milesian Peninsula. We want to acknowledge our many varied institutional and financial sponsors and supporters, including the BIAA and, importantly, the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism and the staff of the Milesian Museum. We also want to thank our many team members pictured here, whose enthusiasm and dedication in the field were so essential. What we will present now was mostly undertaken in summer 2018, actually a season where we were unable to go to the field. For those who are not familiar with the area, the Milesian Peninsula lies in the region of ancient Ionia, today in the province of Aydın, modern Turkey. Evidence for human occupation of the peninsula goes back at least until the 4th millennium BCE. The site of Miletos became a major maritime metropolis from the Archaic period. After the Byzantine period, the peninsula seems to have declined in importance. So this talk is organized into 4 parts: an introduction to the Milesian paradox and the relationship between landscape and economy, a summary of our remote sensing project to document the remains of many linear features on the peninsula, an overview to the proxy evidence we used to suggest probable date and function of these features, and finally we end by considering briefly why the study of these features is important at all. Early archaeologists working at Miletos emphasized the low economic productivity in the region during the 19th century. The peninsula had by then become an economic backwater. The former city, a tiny village nestled amongst ruins. You can see the theater here in the background of the photograph. In contrast, ancient classical sources emphasize the great prosperity of Miletos in the Archaic period and its prestigious foundation of colonies in the Black Sea. Modern scholarship has continued to emphasize the contrast between a relatively poor peninsula and its oversized status in the Archaic period. This is what we might call the Milesian paradox. How did such a marginal peninsula become a major colony founding Aegean metropolis during the Archaic period? The issue this focus raises apply not just the Archaic period. A longue durée history of the Milesian Peninsula is yet to be written. It is important to remember that the configuration of land and sea around Miletos changed substantially through the Holocene. A massive marine transgression until the early Neolithic, and then a dramatic progression of the Meander Delta, accelerating from the first millennium BCE. In the Archaic period, here, bottom left, the city was a major harbor on the Latmian Gulf, but by the 19th century had long been landlocked, and you can see this here on the bottom right. How marginal was the Archaic Milesian Peninsula in reality? Could the motivation behind colonial expansion be a matter of demographic pressure, as some scholars have argued? Here you see a color-coded map reconstruction of the agricultural potential of the peninsula during the Archaic period. The highest potential areas, in light green, measure around 7,600 hectares and would be suitable for cereal production. Using estimates of typical pre-modern yields, the peninsula had the potential to support a population of 30 to 60,000 people. The second level potential land, here in yellow, forms a much larger proportion of the peninsula. Dominated by well-drained karstic limestone and thin soils, they are mostly too poor for cereal agriculture, but could be suitable for olive or vine cultivation and or sheep or goat grazing. For most of the 20th century, these areas were entirely abandoned to the macquis. But remote sensing and aerial photography show that this was not always the case. At some point in the past, a very large portion of this lower potential area was under some kind of exploitation. In 2016, we were unable to run the survey fieldwork. We used the time instead to examine satellite imagery we had bought and 1960s aerial photography from the region that we had purchased from the Turkish mapping division. This is when we first noticed some mysterious structured patterns in the lower potential areas of the peninsula. And here on the right, you see Michael Lloyd now at the BSA helped us to digitize some of them. In 2018, we noticed from Bing Maps and Google Earth imagery that a very large-scale clearance of the macquis had taken place, and this had exposed an elaborate set of linear features in the upland interior of the peninsula. We understood then that the extent of the linear features was much, much larger than we had previously realized, and that we needed to take these features more seriously. That season, we therefore set about digitizing all the linear features we could detect by combining an array of different remote sensing imagery. We don't want to go into practical details here, but happy to talk about sources and methods during questions. The final result was this map, where you can see the main groupings in the interior and southwest parts of the peninsula. You can see here marked Edinburgh. The gap in the middle is an area that has a lot of potential and we could expand on, but wasn't available to us in images then. There is no denying that whatever they are, these features represent a substantial amount of labor invested in the land at some point in the past. If laid out end to end, they would have a total length of 300 kilometers. This is about the same distance as the crow flies between Miletos and Athens. If these linear features were actually dry stone walls, then based on modern hand builders' estimates, 300 kilometers would represent at a minimum 100,000 person days. A team of 4 people working 6 days a week could build them in 80 years, or a larger workforce of, say, 6,000 laborers could complete the task in 1 month. Having created this map, 2 obvious questions arose. What were they for? Indeed, do they all share the same purpose? And when were they built? Were they all built around the same time, or were they built slowly over many centuries? So first, function. Of course, the Milesian Peninsula has been the focus of archaeological research for over 200 years. We soon found that we were not the first to observe some of these features and speculate on their purpose. For example, Gregor and Barbara Borg, who surveyed the geography of the southern part of the peninsula as part of the Didoma project, observed linear features which they argued were discarded waste piles lined along the edges of stone quarrying. An example stone quarry on the left and lines around pits in aerial view on the right. By contrast, Hans Lohmann, who conducted an extensive archaeological survey of the Milesian Kora in the 1990s, observed mandra walling and argued that most of such linear features were agronomic installations. Here you see on the left many linear features in an oblique aerial photo and a close-up of one of these from the ground. Aided by our new extensive database and the detailed remote sensing imagery, we hope to resolve this question.
So in short, close re-examination of shapes and features confirmed to our minds that Lohmann's idea that most of the features are agro-economic structures was the more parsimonious interpretation. So to show you what you mean, here is one of the exposed areas in what is called the Stefania Plateau. This is on the highest part of the peninsula, proper at an elevation of 180 meters. And what you can see here are areas of remaining macquis in this dark green. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse moving, but over here to the right, there's a large area. A few cultivated fields, mostly light green. A few archaeological sites as numbered in Lohmann's survey of the Kora. And this includes on the far left-hand corner, you see number 151, and this is the excavated structure of the so-called Archaic cult complex, which lies upon the presumed route of the Milesian Sacred Way. And the most important thing, which is this large area of bulldozed former macquis, which is here shown in brown. And here you see many linear features, some lighter, white-coloured, some darker brown. And now obviously from the aerial perspective, it's difficult to be sure what these represent, but our initial impression was that the whiter lines were truncated field walls, stone walls, and the dark lines were either ditches or they could be modern irrigation lines. What we now realize is that some of these dark lines are actually the terminal mounds created by the bulldozers. So the area is not entirely flat. So some of these areas are following the contours and create shallow terraces. And when we digitized them and highlighted them on a grayscale base map, it's easy to pick out the different forms. Now, if these are field walls or field boundaries, or at least clearances, what's interesting is that we actually have a range of different plot shapes. So A on the left, we have larger, broadly rectangular plots of 1 to 4 acres. B in the middle, smaller rectangular, often narrower plots. Here, for example, of around 700 square meters. C, oval or circular plots, usually pretty small. These ones at around 500 square meters. So these shapes really do match the sort of shapes we'd expect for A, larger fields of cereal, or more likely tree crops, especially fruit, olives, or vines. B, small garden plots for vegetables. or C, irregular animal shepherding pens, or huts, or indeed potentially threshing floors. So now we turn to the other question, when were they built? Now, dating field walls is notoriously difficult, and in 2018 we had no access to ground information, so naturally we had to approach the question indirectly through a series of proxies. And so as a working hypothesis, we assumed that periods with generally high levels of population, or periods after which there had been a substantial settlement break or abandonment, and then an increase, would predict the most likely periods of expansion and investment into agriculture, into these marginal areas. And that would result in new division of land. So two forms of archaeological survey data provide a proxy for population, site numbers, and the raw numbers of surface material seen in collection. And we can talk about details and caveats with these later, but in short, looking at Lohmann's Milesian Cora survey and just looking at settlements, it shows that the highest peak in site numbers during the early Byzantine period. And then our own intensive project Panormus survey results show a weighted concentration of diagnostic pottery during the early Byzantine and Archaic periods. Alternatively, we can look at paleo-environmental data to reconstruct possible periods of agricultural expansion. Now, sediment cores taken from Lake Baffa and studied by Knipping et al. Provide some broad proxy indicators that there were substantial fluctuations in the intensity of agronomic landscape use on the peninsula through time. Now, unfortunately, the resolution of the sediment cores makes it difficult to pinpoint these fluctuations to absolute dates at a sort of century level. But over millennial scales, there are some strong indications that there was a large-scale clearance of forest and intensification of agriculture from the second half of the first millennium BC, and then again towards the end or the second half of the first millennium AD. So while uncertain, this vague terminus post-quem favours the idea that intensification into the interior of the peninsula did not take place until the Hellenistic period at the earliest, and perhaps there was renewed interest in olives in the early Byzantine period. The other major information we examined was the dimensions of the enclosures themselves, those at least which could be reconstructed when there's a sufficient number of framing perimeter features. And in total, we managed to define 200 enclosures with confidence, and they're shown here on the left. We then calculated the areas of each plot in 2 dimensions. And this graph on the right summarizes the density distribution of the enclosure area. So it's clear that over 90% of the enclosures are less than 10 acres in size, with a notable peak in numbers gathered around the 2 acre mark. So that's 0.8 hectares. Now, today we're accustomed to fixed abstract units to describe land and space generally, but for much of human history, metric quanta of all sorts were far more flexible and could vary according to place and function. Polities might impose local or regional abstract standards, but even within the same polities, alternate standards and more dynamic quanta were considered appropriate. Strabo, writing in the early Roman imperial period, observed variation in the absolute size of shoinai, which is a Hellenistic or Roman measure of length and area, which is often used to measure land. What's important to remember is that he could only recognize this fact because he had a notion of abstract space and access to tools to compare and measure different shoinai. Now, many ancient and pre-metric measures of land area were originally based on functionally important qualities rather than geometric space. So for fields, these could be measured a lot using labor time. For example, the Roman iugerum derives from a term which means yoked, so the ploughing team. And the Byzantine and later Greek term strema refers to turning presumably either of the soil or the plough team itself. But the actual values can vary. Alternatively, fields can be measured in productive potential, either the volume of seed needed to sow or the actual yield that comes from a field. So, for example, Mycenaean land measures seems to have been based on these volumetric assessments. But at certain times, these functional quanta were fixed into standardized abstract values. And as we know from many centuriated landscapes across the Roman Mediterranean, and indeed beyond, agricultural plots were often laid out using such abstract values. Here's an example in Tarraconensis. Now, although the Milesian enclosures are not geometrically arranged, could they nonetheless have been laid out according to abstract quanta and thus be associated with periods in which abstract metrology was more important? So to find out, we ran the entire enclosure dataset through a procedure known as Kendall's cosine quantogram. And in essence, the result is that the highest peaks are the values most likely to have been base modules for a metrological system, if there were a metrological system. And in our case, the highest peak was 0.84. This does not mean that the unit of 0.84 meters squared would have been the actual base unit, but for example, a rounded multiple of that, say 8,400 meters square, which is actually quite close to the 2-acre density peak that we identified. In terms of modularity to known ancient quanta, the closest comparator to this, that divides and multiplies most easily to, is our estimate of Roman Jugera or Byzantine low quality strema. Now, to really make sense of this, more testing is needed. This peak may not, in fact, be significant, and we couldn't see any clear spatial patterning in the distribution of the enclosures that match this 0.84 value. And these are shown here on the right in red compared to the rest of the enclosures, which are shown in blue. So the interim conclusion of this study must be that either the enclosures were not planned to abstract measures, which is maybe not surprising, or that only a small percentage of them were, perhaps some of them to, if we could tentatively link them to Roman or Byzantine, but it's possible that they were built at different times, so some sets linked to different ones. Now, the first chance we had to look directly at some of these features in the field was in September 2019. In fact, when the Anatolian studies article was already complete. So here's a little update from the field for you. We hoped that we could examine linear features and archaeological material together by revisiting Loman sites 105 and 107. Unfortunately, a familiar problem to those working on survey, we were somewhat restricted by the local wildlife. But we did, however, manage to walk some tracks in some of the nearby areas. Now, some of the features in the area are lined up here as shallow terraces, and there's certainly no standing walls, as you can see, but the spread of stones could represent collapsed or bulldozed dry stone walls, or at least small intentionally cleared stones from the fields. And it may not be apparent from the photo, but the soil here is redder than the usual surface soil color that we see elsewhere. So this is a feature we observe inside some other enclosures on the peninsula. We're not 100% sure if it's significant, but it's notable. In most of the area, there are no archaeological finds here on the surface, and the exception was this rather unimpressive looking knoll, which seems to correspond to Loman site number 110. And here there was a concentration of sherds and tiles, as well as 2 grinding stones. Now, this concentration of finds lies nestled in a knotted area of linear features, and it's highly tempted to link the two, perhaps as the center of some kind of farmstead. And as you can see from this graph on the bottom left, the date ranges of the diagnostic finds puts occupation to sometime between the late Archaic to the early Roman period. So let's just summarize those proxies. It's clear that there are still different candidates for the period of construction of the linear features, depending on which proxy you find the most persuasive. Overall, we find the early Byzantine or Archaic periods the most plausible, mostly based on the archaeological find density that we see on the peninsula. But we have to acknowledge that this is tentative. And as ever, more research is needed. And what we'd really like is some direct dating evidence to help confirm or refute our suspicions, and therefore build a more detailed story. What we want to do briefly to finish this talk is to consider why we should study these rural features at all. What is at stake? Now, the Milesian examples are far from the only known enclosures or terraces from around the Aegean, or indeed the wider Mediterranean. And here's a few examples of different types and in different places. Many are clearly terrace structures or pens for animals, and no doubt have important practical functions, either to prevent soil loss on hilly terrain or to protect herds from wild animals. We wonder whether there's been too much emphasis, however, on their technical aspects and less on their socio-economic implications. Stone enclosures are not simply ephemeral and innocent practical aspects of quiet rural idyll. For example, the effects of the Enclosure Acts in early modern Britain have been argued by social historians to produce a fossilization of property tenure rights. It gave some groups the ability to monopolize the products of land, control access through trespass laws, and herd rural populations towards the urban factories at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, we don't yet know the exact conditions under which the Milesian linear features were constructed, but we should expect them to index some important social economic trend. In fact, a striking parallel is found in modern day Milesia. And you can see a photo of the fence there on the left. Access to the central areas of the peninsula, which was previously unimpeded for wildlife and for walkers alike, is slowly being divvied up and fenced as land is sold for new intensive olive production. And with 30 years of remote sensing data now online, it's easier to see the dramatic ecological effects of the modern process of clearance and enclosure. So, for example, here you see in this NDVI trends over 25 years, this area of blue is where there's been a considerable amount of clearance of vegetation. The blue in the bottom left here is clearance due to urbanization. This is modern Didymm. But you see another clearance in the top left hand corner over here. So it's ironic that it's the modern forms of clearance and enclosure that are responsible both for exposing the palimpsest evidence of previous field enclosure programs, and alas, for their potential destruction. Now, social practices that limit and divide the land and its produce are not new, and we'd like briefly to reference a famous resident of Archaic Miletos, the pre-Socratic philosopher Thales. Now, one story about him was used by the ancients to prove his wisdom, and today ancient historians use it to confirm olive production in the region in his time. I'll just read. Thales raised the money to put a deposit on the olive presses of Miletos in Chios, so that when the harvest was ready, he was able to let them out at a rate which brought him considerable profit. Now, to us, the important point about this story is that there was a legal system in place that allowed Thales the right to monopolize the olive presses, and for those rights to be upheld and enforced so that he could extract labor indirectly from renting out the presses. The linear features of the Milesian Peninsula, whatever their actual date, are imprints of land ownership and thus alternative technologies of establishing rights to the land and the labor of others. So both presses and enclosures are therefore part of a long economic tradition. So just to round out and finish the talk, let's briefly summarize our take-home messages. So far from being empty of archaeological remains, which you might think driving along the main roads into Didymm, the marginal parts of the Milesian Peninsula are actually full of clues to ancient agronomic activity. Tentatively, we think the proxy evidence suggests the early Byzantine or Archaic periods as the most likely times for their construction. Most do not seem to have been laid out using abstract geometric quanta, so they were likely built as agglutinative investments, perhaps over long periods. But it seems likely that they were created when legal rights to the land or the environmental conditions encouraged this kind of division and monopolization. Finally, a note of worry, and that's obviously, we talked about it a lot, is the fact that these features are under threat. Many have already been scraped away by the bulldozer, and in order to create modern agro-industrial enclosures. So essentially, we hope that by raising the profile of these otherwise invisible features and to encourage their study, it may be easier to protect and investigate such important rural remains here and in other regions in the future. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening, and we look forward to questions.
Thank you very much, Anja and Toby. Thank you. Fantastic. So I encourage everybody once more to type your questions into the Q&A box, and I will read them out for our speakers. But while you are all thinking, I do have a couple of questions just to kick us off. One is about the broader applicability of your method, because obviously your paper has got some really important things to say about the history of Milesia and history and archaeology of Milesia, but it also, the method is in itself really exciting, and there's loads of applications for it in all kinds of parts of the Mediterranean that you can think of. My question is, do you think it would be harder to do on a more slopey, that's not a great way of describing it, a more sloping environment where things are basically less flat? If we're looking at more terraces, where you're dealing with a much more kind of vertically arranged landscape, do you think it would be harder to do?
Shall I go first? I think yes, no. I mean, I think obviously the broad principles of the methods are the same. What you would have to take additionally into account, perhaps is something we didn't worry so much about, is that one tends to digitize two-dimensionally from these maps because that's the easiest data that we have. And so if you're looking, for example, at areas, then obviously a surface area is not the same if it's a slope as opposed to if it's flat. But if we're talking about flat terraces, then the flat terraces are going to be two-dimensional anyway, so that's not going to make any difference. The question is, where do you measure the beginning of a terrace area, and where do you know, what are the edges? But this is a problem you have whatever. So yeah. I would love to see. I would love to see this done in different places as well, and in Cilicia, of course. I think, you know, we definitely have some of these things which look like these features, and it would be really useful to, you know, to think of your methodology as a way to kind of get a sense of when they could have been built. That's super exciting. I'm now going to go across to some of the questions in the Q&A box because they are already building up. Alan asks, on what basis do you calculate a population of 30 to 60,000 people?
Yes. When we talked about possible questions, this was the one that popped into our minds first. Thank you, Alan. So we don't actually say that there have been 30 to 60,000. So we try to approach the question from the other end. So how much potential agricultural high potential land do we have? And what are the estimates of this land being used? How many people would they feed? And this goes back to George Philip, who calculated like how many hectares you need, and then it's a base of 4 to 5 family members and so on. Wasn't it, Toby? Yeah, okay. I thought you did this. While normally with Miletos, people start from the other end and they like, how many ships did we have at Lade and how many people do we think are involved in this number as a family behind the citizen who mans the ship. We tried to come from the other direction, so trying to look at the land and how many people would it feed, but it doesn't help us solve the question of how many people did we have here.
Do you have anything to add, Toby, to that?
Yes, I mean, I guess the important point is that estimate is purely a carrying capacity. It's not an estimate of actual population. So we have all sorts of other things, but this is a sort of idea of a threshold. And obviously, you know, these are based on sort of estimates of what kind of yield you might get, and they're very generalized. So I wouldn't want to like promise anything, but it's just to give us an idea that relatively to different landscapes what you might get.
No, it is useful to have that kind of ballpark figure, and it's a pretty big ballpark, between 30 and 60,000. So, but it's handy to have also. Kathy Draycott asked, the dating is very difficult. Did you say that there are ways that you can see resolving that in the future?
Well, actually, the next question on the list is from Sam Turner, and he's possibly the person who could answer that. So we hope that we might be able to do some OSL dating if we can find the right locations, and if, you know, fieldwork's allowed and all these sorts of things, which might give us some direct steers, which allows us to control these things, which otherwise we're very reliant on proxy data.
Do you want to take Sam's question at the same time? He says, thank you. And were you able to detect much in the way of chronology, i.e. relationships between the features? How long do you think they might have been functional?
I have to say, from what we saw in the field, it was, I mean, we only studied one area closely, so it could be the other areas will give us some more information. But the area that we looked at, it was not obvious. You couldn't clearly see any relational, you know, stratigraphic or whatever. Otherwise, you know, one thing superimposed on another. That might not be the case in other parts. So
we did hope. Yeah, we did hope to go last summer, and then COVID came, and so we do hope to be able to go this summer to revisit some of them. But yeah,
actually, almost slightly as an offshoot from that, is there any spatial kind of clustering? So I know you kind of analysed them in terms of their different sizes of the different enclosures, but is there anything like, you know, there's loads of round ones up in the northwest and loads of thin ones in the south? I mean, is there any kind of patterning to the data in that way?
Should I go first? I don't. Not particularly. I mean, the only there is one zone which is where you have many more sort of long, thin enclosures, and that is precisely the place where you have the highest slopes. So, I mean, what that looks like is that is terracing basically, and you don't see those same terraces elsewhere. But there isn't a clear, you know, the round ones are in this area and the large ones in this area. They seem to be relatively mixed. I think that's fair, isn't it? I mean, map again.
There's a related question from Jamie Donati, who asks, have you been able to use terrain models and slope models to assess if location of the terrace walls and anomalies may have any patterns as far as altitudes and sloping terrain. So I was just thinking off the top of my head, but Janie's put this much more in a much more articulate way, obviously much more articulate than I'm speaking now, to think about this more analytically.
Yeah, that's not something we've done, but that's something obviously we could do. That's a good idea. So thank you.
Fantastic. Evangelia Piskin asks, what method or criteria are you using for classifying land as high potential or medium potential, and so on?
That's you again, Toby.
That's me again. Picking on me today. No, it's a good question. So it's obviously quite difficult to define, but the way we've done it, we started with a geological map, and we looked at the areas which were marls, which obviously where you have deeper soils, and those sort of form the basis of the good quality. And then the second level is the karstic limestone, where we know that there are thinner soils. Obviously, this is not being fully mapped, so some of the edges are probably a bit fuzzy. But I mean, you can pretty much see that the two areas, the high potential and the medium potential, basically coincide with the areas which have been settled over the 20th century, because those are the highest quality lands, and then the areas which have been abandoned. So yeah, I hope that makes some kind of sense.
Yes, and I think that probably also answers Paul Steinfield's question about the differing levels of agriculture potential as well, which is great. James Crow is a question, actually two, but you've answered one already. So can you clarify exactly what you mean by the early Byzantine period and the late first millennium? Is that no, oh, right, okay. Late antiquity, early Byzantine, no.
Well, I mean, the pottery from the survey is quite certain, isn't it, Anja? I mean, I think that's where the pottery data is quite firm. I can't remember off the top of my head what we said it was.
Yes, so I mean, for some of them where we did the walking, we have the finds, the pottery from around it, but to try and also answer Elif's questions that is next, about like trying to find ways to date them better or think about their long-term use. I mean, obviously it would be good at some point to have a test excavation in some of them, like being able to cut and really test. So there's only so much we can do from not being in the field and looking at photographs and trying to analyze those, and obviously not having been able to go to the field last year and didn't really help resolving that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that addresses Elif's question about dating, but also Sabina Hoy, a little bit further down the list, has also got a question about diagnostic findings at sites, and I suppose that is just partly a question of getting out.
There is, for Sabina's question, I mean, there really is, we did find a lot of amphora shapes, and I remember specifically the mushroom type, I mean, because it's so easy to recognize in the field. So yeah, but again, this is something which we haven't done for this article yet, kind of merging the results from the survey with the ideas we presented here.
I mean, related to that, we've got some questions about construction of these things. Is there anything we can tell from the construction of them which might help with the dating? Christoph Burns has said the mass of stones in some of them is enormous, as far as I can remember from my visit, and he says thank you.
In terms of construction technique, I mean, it's because we haven't seen anything that's, you know, a solid wall. It's difficult to say. I mean, they could simply be just piled stones. as it were, dry stone walling. I mean, they're smaller than the typical dry stone that you would get, you know, in the north of England or whatever. They're not large blocks. They're sort of smaller pebbles. So I suspect they're just cleared and then used. That seems to be the clear thing. Whether that gives us any dating evidence, I suspect not.
Actually, somebody, Urania Kuka, hi Urania, has also asked further on down about the specific methods of building and the materials. But if it's really just field stones kind of piled up, that makes it much harder.
Very tricky,
There's a clutch of questions which have come in asking about the relationship of these features to other landscape features. So notably the Sacred Way, Derek Wellsby mentions that. Lisa Kielhofer talks about alignment between different road sites and other features. Magdalena Staffan is also saying, do we have road-like patterns that we can relate these features to?
Yeah, the road thing's interesting, isn't it? Because in a lot of terrace systems, you have these sort of calderimes where you have sort of the roads built into. I mean, I've seen a lot of these on Kithra, for example, where you've got the side walls are built with the tracks inbuilt. We didn't recognize anything like that. I mean, you know, it might be a matter of resolution from what we've got, and it may be just the areas. I mean, as I say, we've only managed to visit a couple of places, but certainly from satellite imagery, we couldn't recognize particular roads. Yeah, I mean the Stefania, as the one that we showed, is very close to the route of the so-called Sacred Way, and the Sacred Way does have sort of terrace blocks along some parts of it. But it's not 100% clear that's the same thing.
Honestly, there's a few more questions because there's so many questions. I'm sorry, guys, you're so popular. There's a few more questions which are on this similar kind of theme about relationship with roots and smaller and other things. Gordon Higgs, for example, asks, do they link up something like previously unknown settlement centers? Can we see these as related to that? And Malcolm Wagstaff, I think I've just found it. Oh no, sorry, I've lost that. Yes, Malcolm Wagstaff says, is there anything to do with perhaps the distance from Miletos and the idea of distance decay, where land use gets less intensive as the distance from the operation centre increases? So these are all questions to do with linking and alignment and routes and roads and travel.
I mean, what we have seen in terms of like finds in the landscape during our survey is that we do have these peaks in the Archaic period and in the late Roman Byzantine period, but this kind of goes together with periods that produce a lot of ceramics as well. So we need to be careful here with the picture we're getting, and our assumption is that these are periods where a lot is happening, and therefore we kind of expect people spreading out in the landscape, using the landscape. But I think again, I feel a bit bad that we can't answer most of the questions like clearly, but this is mainly because what we've done is a work that is based on satellite imagery and obviously trying to include the survey, but we haven't been able to then actually go in the field and test our assumption again in the field. And so so there are a number of really good ideas here, so thank you all very much. One of them obviously being that we're not saying that all the features you see on the map are built in the same way. So this is not the case. There are differences in the height, in the type of stones used and stuff. But these things, you can only do this then by actually going around and mapping those in the field, and not from using satellite imagery looking at field boundaries. But this was not like what we started off with when we started thinking about whether or not there is a pattern. So one starting point of what we tried to follow up was when inscriptions, for example, name a new land division, so in the Hellenistic period. So is this something you can then actually see as emerging? And this ties to your question, Nish, at the beginning, you know, is this something we can apply elsewhere? So areas where you actually have this epigraphical evidence would be a great starting point to see whether the method works there, and you find repeating measurements or patterns. But as it stands at the moment, we're not able to date them. We have these peaks. We know that there are certain types of ceramic prevailing, but it's not like really firm evidence, is it? Yeah. Toby?
Can I answer the question on the people? I think it's clear that we suspect that there are at least small settlements in these areas. I mean, there may be tiny hamlets or farmsteads rather than towns, because simply because of the carrying capacity of that particular area. But I think, yes, I mean, there must be dots of settlements in the broader sense across the landscape, which these fit between. And Lohmann survey obviously shows that to some extent.
Okay, I think to get through some of these questions, I'm afraid we're going to, let's just go through them more in order. Judith asked, actually perhaps linked to what you just said, Anja, about are there contemporary written records which can tell us about the agricultural activities and their social function?
Not for the Milesian peninsula, but for example with Priene, so nearby, this is where we have an inscription. Now, I'm sorry, what was the other question?
It was just about literary records, but I think you're absolutely right. If we can find places where you have an epigraphic record of agricultural reform, that would be the perfect match to try and.
Yes, not for this area here now.
Yeah. Another question from John Malcolm Wagstaff about red soils. You mentioned red soils. They're common on limestone, but what significance do you have here? What do they have here? Sorry, red soils.
The danger of sounding like we don't know, and we're not really sure. It's just notable that the default soil is not as red as the red soils within these blocks. Now, it may just be that's a factor of what happens to the limestone when it's cleared and you've got a little trough building up. I don't know exactly, but there are some of the place names on the Wilski map do sort of indicate areas of different coloured soil. So perhaps it does have some agricultural significance, but we're not 100% sure what that might be.
Yeah, I suppose there's another question which is perhaps linked to understanding of different soils and their agricultural potential is there any microbiological evidence of possible crops in the sample rocks?
That's not something we've looked at. No.
That would require kind of sampling and all kinds of things, I suppose. There is a clutch of questions. Sorry, I'm going to come back to some of the ones at the top later. There's a clutch of questions about different types of satellite imagery. Giacomo Fontana says, do you have any LiDAR data available for the area, or are you planning to collect some? This might be useful for assessing the visibility of the linear features in the satellite images. And James Crow suggests that you might be able to use drone imagery for a higher resolution as well. So LiDARs.
Those are both very good ideas and things we want to do. We did start doing some drone imagery, but it took so long to get the permissions that we managed one day in 2019, which was not really enough, unfortunately.
Never mind. Still, we can hope for the future. Elif has asked about the typology of different types of terraces and when it comes to their building systems. Is there a typology of different building construction methods when it comes to terraces?
We couldn't find one. It's something we looked into, and it's interesting because actually terraces have been studied quite a lot. I mean, intermittently over 100 years, and certainly since aerial photography became a thing in the 1920s or so. So it's interesting that it has, there's not been systematized. It may be that it's impossible to systematize, but it's certainly something worthwhile thinking more about, whether that's something, you know, we should be doing more collaborative work comparing different landscapes, and maybe we would actually have better ways to talk about them. Yeah, that's a good suggestion. Yeah.
But it's difficult, as you said. I think if a lot of what you're dealing with is field stones, which are just kind of put together, it's difficult to break that down, I suppose. Evangelia Piskin has a comment saying that farmers working in stony fields regularly pick the stones out of their field to clear it up to facilitate cultivation. They usually dispose of these stones by putting them on the borders of the property. So this could, she suggests that this could be part of what is going on, perhaps. And Urania Kukan, on a similar line, mentions stone material in secondary use. Do you have stone material in secondary use? Is this something that you have definite evidence of?
Not in the areas we've looked at so far, no.
Okay. There's a couple of questions. Elif Corporal again and Ashley Kakone talks about, Elif asks if you have strategies to try and find the less visible sites, either the short-term or rural sites. Is there a way of kind of looking in terms of proximity to terraces? Have you got a deliberate strategy for doing that? And Ashley says, have you found evidence of stations or stopping areas, again, slightly more ephemeral sites, by using your satellite imagery?
Well, I can't see the questions anymore. It was easier to.
Oh, I'm sorry. You can go. You can move to answered. Those are the ones where, yes, ones that we've addressed. I'm sorry. There's just so many questions. There's so much to talk about.
No, it's really good. No, thank you, everyone. So no, from the satellite imagery, we haven't picked up sites from the satellite imagery directly, and I think that's probably because most of them are at a very ephemeral level, and the scale of the satellite imagery is just not high enough to see these kind of rural structures anyway. The exception is probably where, you know, there's been illegal excavations and then you can see a hole in the ground, which unfortunately does happen sometimes. But
you have some comments and questions from Hans Lohmann, who says he disagrees with the approach, some of the methods and results, and he brings up the farmsteads closely connected to the field walls, that before the invention of hydraulic mortar, it's not really possible to settle on the Stefania Plateau because you need cisterns for collecting the water, and there isn't really water or springs there. His question is about taking into consideration the degradation of the landscape over the centuries. And how does it relate to his map of archaic sites?
Shall I go first or you?
Yeah, I don't mind.
I mean, you know, he's absolutely right that water is not one of the proxies that we looked at, and it is actually quite an important one. Yeah, I mean, it's something we need to think further, and maybe that would push the probability of where these are linked in time to later periods. So maybe Archaic period is just, you know, out of question because it's impossible. I mean, I think in the context, I mean, we do have the Archaic cult complex up there, but maybe it wouldn't have been possible at scale. So yeah, it's a reasonable question.
Yes, I agree. But I think that maybe what we said wasn't clear enough or partly misunderstood. So we weren't actually advocating settlement in the Stefania Plateau or something. What is quite interesting, however, is the archaic material we found quite evenly distributed. So this was interesting in terms of landscape use. When it comes to field boundaries or structures that relate to what was found during the survey, I think the one example we've been showing was actually trying to make the point that there could be the relationship you think there was at a later period. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting that, as you say in the published version of this article, this is very deliberately a multidisciplinary approach, and you're trying to bring together lots of things, and it's, there's always more things to factor in. So factoring water, there are ways to refine and that's kind of interesting to talk about. And on the topic of water, we've got more about water actually. So John Scott says, is there no evidence of irrigation or natural water channels? Is there a relationship between the peaks and the climate patterns? And Hans Lohmann again has mentioned irrigation, that olive trees are the best option for the Stefania Plateau because of the water provision there, basically. And he says that it testifies, the fact that we've got lots of oil presses and oil mills testifies the enormous importance of oil production.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they're putting out there today. They're bulldozing the whole thing and putting in olive trees. So, yeah, the modern farmers agree.
Yes, again, and on the question of natural water sources and so on. So while the images show a huge area, we weren't actually able to walk there. So again, there was obviously a number of things that we would like to check or we would like to revisit, but it wasn't possible for the obvious reasons since a couple of months now. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's a question from Richard Hughes, which I suspect the answer might be it's not possible to know. But he says, if these walls fell down a bit, and if they weren't robbed, and assuming that there's a standard wall width, could we potentially estimate their original height?
I mean, yeah, obviously anything's possible. I mean, I think it would be tricky from what we've got at the moment, at least from the places where we've seen, where they've been sort of wiped out by the bulldozer. It might be possible in some other areas if we can somehow estimate the volume of stone. We certainly don't know if there's a standard width, so that's going to be tricky, but we could come up with an estimate, I suppose, yeah.
I suspect that there's no way of knowing how many stones may have been removed over the centuries, so that might be an almost impossible. I imagine that might be pretty difficult to do. Brian Bealey has a question about do you have any idea what local people think about these features and what they say?
Yeah, we ask them about them quite often, and they always say, oh yeah, there's loads of them, but they don't have very much interest in them. It's interesting. It's not really a big part of the consciousness of the history of the peninsula, which is a bit of pity in our opinion. But they're certainly recognised as being there, and they're recognised as being something old. Yeah.
So I suppose there's a lot of antiquities in the peninsula for people to have. If there are going to be local stories attached to things, you might attach it to those big whopping giant remains that you have on the peninsula rather than the walls, I imagine. But
yeah, I mean, there's a problem that archaeology has generally, which is that we still are attracted to the gold and the large temples, and that's true of the general public as well as archaeologists, unfortunately. So field walls doesn't sound exciting in the grand scheme of things, but actually is quite important for understanding processes if we can get a better grasp on them.
I think you both have made field walls pretty exciting this evening. So exciting that we've had a record-breaking number of questions in a seminar. So thank you both very, very much for that. There's a comment that have come in on the chat box rather than the Q&A, mentioning that actually the Didymer lion, the very famous Didymer lion, was actually also pulled from a field wall at some stage, and the lion in the British Museum. Is that right?
But I'm just saying this. Where this was from is not part of one of these terrace walls we've been investigating. Yes, it was found on a field, and nearby is probably a grave monument or some such, but that's not quite the same, and that this was not quite what I thought her question was about, of like reused stones. Yeah.
Yeah,
but obviously you have this. I mean, you have like you have worked stones everywhere in the landscape flying around on the Milesian Peninsula, but they're not necessarily part of these features we've been trying to investigate. Yeah.
That makes sense. There's 2 last-minute questions, if you're willing to hang on for an extra few minutes. 2 last-minute questions that come in the Q&A box. Olivier mentions that the plateau is perfect for sheep, considering that Miletos was also famous for its wool, but still sheep needs. Sheep need water. I'm sorry, speaking today is difficult. So yes, do you feel, how far do you feel that pastoralism can be seen in what you found?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, sorry, there's a delay. Yeah, I think yes, definitely sheep are going to be an important part of it. I mean, one question we had, I mean, in fact, when we originally started, we were thinking, oh, these are all pastoral installations, and then when we saw the shape of them, we started to doubt that a little bit, and the question is how much of the wool that was used in the Milesian wool industry actually comes from the peninsula, or how much is imported, and I don't know, Anna, you know better than me, but I'm not sure we have any idea.
So yeah, I mean, there is some evidence that they also imported raw wool, but from the written sources, at least for the Archaic period, we know that wool was a major factor, but maybe not in the as far as the Stefania hills. Yeah, I agree. I mean, but this is really an important point, but probably not something that can be necessarily be done by us, but a clearer idea of water resources. Yeah.
Now, very last question. I am sorry, but I'm going to draw a line under this last question. Mustafa Tatbul asks, for both the Archaic and early Byzantine period, there were Eastern political threats, so Persian and then Persian Arab. Do you think these long-term crises might have effects on the limited agricultural use of the land, therefore an intensive pattern squeezed into the peninsula, whilst into the east, inland, there may have been more space to spread out? Some deep thinking going on there. deep thinking. Mustafa, it's an excellent question.
I'm not sure exactly how we test it. No, I think it's a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Whether the Milesian Peninsula is a kind of refugia for populations to the east. Yeah, very difficult to test. It's not my period of expertise.
I mean, there is the famous, the famous source about under Alias's, they're coming in and destroying the harvest, and whether or not that meant the cereals or the olive trees. If they had destroyed the olive trees, obviously they wouldn't have been able to recover from that so quickly. So this is a good question, and this was one we tried to address at the last part of our lecture. The question is like, if these are boundaries, if this does tell us something about who's owning the land or who decides on ownership and things, how do you enforce this? So how do you secure it? So in this regard, it's a very good question, just very big and over obviously different periods, but something definitely worth thinking about a bit longer. Yeah,
I think this is some of the questions at the end of this, is that, you know, whenever we do end up updating these features, that it does certainly constitute a significant shift in the way people interact with the landscape one way or the other, especially if we think that these happened in a single horizon or around a single time period. That it's psychologically, in the way that the polis works with the hora, it has significant implications, just as you said, Toby, at the end, for the kind of the socio-political meaning of this is massive. Having said that, ending with the huge socio-political meanings of this, I am going to finish up for this evening. Thank you to our two panelists, Anja and Toby. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening and for sending your comments and questions and thoughts. And there's lots of thank yous in the chat. Hello, we love you all very, very much. It's nice to see you all. We hope to see you next month. Oh, sorry, Toby, go ahead.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Yes.
Absolutely. We hope to see you all next month, where we'll be starting on our the first of our papers from the 2021 volume. Do check out the BIAA website for more details. And on that, I'm going to say Iek Shamla to our two speakers, Iek Shamla to all of our attendees, and we will see you again.